Joining me now is economics editor at the Australian Adam Creighton. Adam, good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. So it's all about MYEFO at the moment, and you know the government still likes to stay positive about things. But in your opinion, how much is there to be positive about?
Well, certainly those future surpluses that the government has been talking about, for years now, they're getting much more slender. I think we really need to emphasise how fragile they are. For instance, this year the surplus is now penciled in at $5 billion, and by the fourth year it will only be $4 billion. Now, this is a government that spends about $500 billion a year, so these really are very small rounding errors. If something goes wrong in the economy, if commodity prices don't live up to expectations, then you'll see those surpluses vanish.
Well, and that's something that you write about in your article today, Adam. I mean, what happens if the US sneezes? Do we catch a cold?
Well, certainly the atmospherics at the moment are the opposite. So we've seen stock markets boom in the past few days, both in Australia and around the world, and of course that's on the back of this tentative trade deal that the US and China have reached last week. It's probably worth pointing out just on that deal that it does involve China purchasing more farming products from the US, so it might be good for the world economy, but certainly not necessarily good for the Australian economy if it diverts Chinese purchases away from us. And of course there's more atmospherics about further cuts in official interest rates too, so that's of course going to buoy stock markets. I note here the probability of a February rate cut has inched up to 45% now, following MYEFO.
Well, what about, I mean, the cost of iron ore, which the government has valued at about $55, right? So if that, excuse me, if that stays high, then that it stands to reason that the larger surplus will come back.
Yeah, certainly the government has held the iron ore price forecast at $55 for some years now, actually, and of course, as we know, it's been much higher than that recently. I think it's closer than to $90 at the moment, and if it stays at $90 until the end of June next year, I think my understanding is that the surplus will be $3.5 billion higher than the $5 billion that is penciled in. But that's all very well, but there are many other moving parts to the budget as well, and of course, if there was another downgrade in the wage growth figures, there was then that would have a much larger impact on revenue forecasts than the iron ore price, because wages are such a large part of national income. I
guess then, I mean, worst case scenario here, if that iron ore price drops below $55, then I mean, does the government then, how can it afford that second tranche of tax cuts?
Well, that's actually the interesting thing here, Pete, because the surpluses now are so much smaller. It makes it so much harder for the government to do any sort of stimulus, whether it's more spending or bringing forward those tax cuts. The second tranche of tax cuts, I think, due to start in 2022, they cost about $6 billion a year. So the surplus this year, $5 billion, for instance, they can't bring it forward, if you like, without kind of penciling in a deficit. The political importance of a surplus for this government is all important, as we note. It's worth pointing out that economically speaking, whether it's a $5 billion surplus or a $5 billion deficit is completely irrelevant, really, to everyone outside of Australia, actually.
Yeah, well when you compare that to...
This is not something people talk about in
especially, sorry, mate, especially when you compare that to, like you said before, it's a $500 billion budget, it's a snip, isn't it?
Exactly, that's right. Look, we have a AAA credit rating still. I mean, the finances of the Australian government are very good compared to other countries. I mean, just to take one statistic, I've been in the UK last week, and British government debt is about 85% of GDP, which is enormous, whereas in Australia it's about 20. So if there were a shock, we certainly are in much better position as a government to deal with that.
And just on that, what do you expect the fallout to be economically once Britain does leave the European Union?
Well, look, I think the increase in certainty is a very good thing for the British economy, even for the European economy too, for the world economy. It certainly expedites a free trade agreement between the UK and Australia, which may even be concluded by the end of next year. I think both governments have been making sounds about that. Look, I think it's largely going to be a symbolic agreement because Australia and Britain are still very far apart from each other, and there's no way Australia could possibly replace the EU in terms of trade importance. And it's also worth pointing out that we have the upper hand in these negotiations, because it's the British government that will want to show its own people that it's able to negotiate fairly quickly new free trade deals with other countries, and so it means countries like Australia, New Zealand, the US, of course, will actually have the upper hand in those negotiations.
I'm curious, Adam, what did you make of the size of that margin of victory for Boris Johnson?
Well, look, I wasn't really that surprised. I mean, in hindsight, if you look at the offering from the other side, it was so bad. Jeremy Corbyn was such a terrible leader. Many things the Labor Party stood for and proposed would have been very bad. the fact that they didn't have a clear position on Brexit, I thought was the number one thing for all those voters in the north of England who voted Brexit, and yet the party that they'd supported for decades had no clear position. It wasn't a surprise, I thought, that that many hundreds of thousands of them switched to the Conservatives. The question now is whether they remain Tory voters in these seats at the next general election, but because of British election cycles are quite long, 5 years away, we don't have to worry about that for quite some time.
Yeah, absolutely. Significantly longer than they are here. Adam Creighton, appreciate your time as always. Thank you very much.
Mate.
We'll talk to you soon.